This is Theology 2, and this is part 1 of the video lecture on the nature and extent of sin. In 1741, at the height of the Great Awakening in the American colonies, Jonathan Edwards gave a sermon entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." If you ever have the opportunity to visit the church where Jonathan Edwards first gave this sermon, what you will find is you will see indentation marks in the backs of some of the pews there. These indentation marks were left by the hearers who first heard Jonathan Edwards' sermon. These listeners were so frightened by Jonathan Edwards' descriptions of hell that they literally dug their fingernails into the backs of the pews in front of them and left these permanent indentation marks. Now, this episode from church history raises a key question for us. And that question is, how serious is sin? We know that sin entered the world when Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But what exactly is the nature of sin, and what is sin's impact upon creation itself and upon the human race in particular? One of the great debates in the history of Christianity is the essence and nature of sin, as well as the extent of its effect and its impact upon the human race in particular and creation as a whole. Today, we're going to explore these questions, and we're going to see what we can learn about the nature and extent of sin. So let's first look at the nature of sin. There are some Hebrew and Greek terms that are used in the Bible for sin. The first Hebrew term that I want to mention is the Hebrew word chata, which can also be transliterated as kata. And then there is the Greek word hamartia. And both of these are words that the Bible uses for sin. And the basic meaning of kata and hamartia is to miss the mark. And so the picture we can have in our mind is of an archer trying to shoot a bow and arrow at a target, and they just keep missing the mark. And this is the basic meaning for the word kata and hamartia. For example, in Judges 20:16, it says 700 chosen men who could sling stones at a hair's breadth and not miss. Well, that word miss in this verse in the Old Testament is the word kata, which is the same word that the Old Testament uses for sin. Now, kata and hamartia is the most common word for sin in the Bible. So this means that the most common understanding of sin is the Bible is to miss the mark. Now, it is in failing and missing the true end and scope of our lives, both what we do and who we are, that is ungodliness. That's the meaning of the missing the mark. God has created us to live lives of godliness. And when we miss that mark, when we fail to live the kind of godly life that God wants us to live, then we have missed the mark and we have sinned. And we find this expressed in the familiar verse of Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so we have this basic idea of missing the mark. We were created in God's image and intended to be godlike in righteousness, holiness, goodness, and in our relation to others, and so forth. Every departure from this design that God has for us is missing God's intended goal. And so the word itself here, kata and hamartia, implies that humanity has fallen. The word itself also implies blameworthiness, whether the sin is against God or whether our sin is against other human beings. Regardless of who we sin against, whether it's against God or against other human beings, we are blameworthy. In short, it means to sin. To sin means to fall short of our obligation to God, to fall short of God's design and expectation towards us. So that's the basic meaning of the word sin in the Bible. Another word for sin that is used in the Bible is the word avar. That's the Hebrew word avar, and in Greek we have the word parabasis. And the meaning of these words is transgression. And the basic meaning of transgression means to overstep or cross a line or boundary. So the idea is that there are certain red lines that God has set down. And when we cross those lines, we have transgressed those lines, and that is, we have broken God's commandment and we have sinned. So transgression is also distinguished from sin in general, because Romans 5 verses 13 and 14 says, sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins, hamartia, were not like the transgression, parabasis. In the NIV, it says, even over those who did not sin by breaking a commandment as Adam did, of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. So we have a distinction between sin and transgression. Sin is the more general term for falling short of God's standards. Transgression implies crossing over a definite standard. It is a more deliberate and definite act of disobedience. So we see from these two words that sin is both a falling short of and a deliberate act of disobedience. Now, there are 9 other terms used in Hebrew to denote sin. We will not be able to look closely at all of them, but let's just take a quick look at these words and their meanings. So the first of these terms is the word avat. Avat means wrong, wicked, or perverse. And the basic meaning is twisted or bent. Isaiah 21:3 is an example of this basic meaning. With respect to sin, this word avat points to the perversion or distortion which is caused by evil doing. Girdlestone says that it is the perversion or distortion of nature which is caused by evil that is represented by a var. It can refer to the inner condition of a person or to the nature of the act or result. So Avat refers to how sin is twisted and bent. The next Hebrew word is the word Maal, which means travail, toil, or trouble. The basic idea is of toil or travail, although it is often translated as mischief, wickedness, or trouble. And the reality is that when we sin, and when we, throughout our lives, when we sin makes life a burden, okay? Because of sin, life is no longer the existence that God originally created it to be. Because of sin, life has become a heavy, toilsome burden. Another Greek word for sin is the word aval. Aval means iniquity, wickedness, or unrighteousness. This word is used only 4 times and is translated as above. It seems to denote a departure from what is right and just, or equal or fair, and a lack of right and justice or fairness. As such, sin is a deprivation or lack of right or justice. So an example of the meaning of the word aval can be seen in an unjust court ruling. Because when a judge makes an unjust court ruling, that judge is departing from what is right and what is fair and what is just. So that's what the word aval means. It is translated as iniquity, right, wickedness, and unrighteousness, but it carries this idea of departing from right or fairness or justice. Another Hebrew word that is used to describe sin is the word ra. And ra simply means evil. And the basic idea of ra is breaking up or in ruin. It is a word which binds together the wicked deed and its consequences. This is according to Girdlestone. It is often translated by such words as calamity, adversity, distress, grief, affliction, misery, sorrow, trouble, hurt, etc. It usually indicates the wrongdoing as a breach of harmony, a breaking up of what is good or desirable for humanity and in society. And it also denotes a breaking up of what is good in relation to God. The next Hebrew word I want to mention is the word Tasha, which means rebellion. Now, the basic meaning of Tasha is to revolt or to refuse to be subject to authority. It is often translated to rebel, to trespass, or to transgress. Then there is the word Rasha. Rasha is translated as wickedness or turmoil. And Girdlestone says that Rasha originally referred to the activity, the tossing and confusion in which the wicked live, and the perpetual agitation that they cause others. Thus, Rasha gives us a picture of the trouble caused by wicked living. Perhaps we might even infer from this analogy that wickedness and turmoil go hand in hand. It refers to turmoil instead of peace. So when we see the word Rasha in the Old Testament, we are reminded of the fact that wickedness and evil and sin leads to turmoil, that it leads to a lack of peace. Another Hebrew word that is used to describe sin is the word Maal. And Maal is often translated as unfaithfulness or transgression. And the basic idea of the word Maal is a breach of trust. Therefore, it points to the unfaithfulness and treachery of sin. It represents sin or wrongdoing as a breach of trust. Then we have the Hebrew word Aven. Aven is often translated as vanity or emptiness. It is also sometimes translated as iniquity. This word is usually translated as iniquity, but its root probably have to do with vanity, futility, or emptiness. And just a quick note here, the word vanity in older English often means emptiness or emptiness. Now, Amos 5:5 is an example of this root idea, because in Amos 5:5 it says, and Bethel will come to nothing. And that word nothing is the word Aven in Hebrew. Girdlestone contends that Aven does not so much suggest a breach of law or injury done to another. Instead, he suggests that a course of conduct is undertaken that will, in the end, prove unprofitable to the sinner. Thus, this word Aven represents the evil devices of humankind as hollow, false, vain, or empty, and unprofitable. The next Hebrew word I want to mention is the word Asham. Asham is often translated as guilt, but it especially refers to unconscious and unintentional sin. For example, if you're drinking alcohol while you're driving and you hit and maybe even kill another person, well, you did not intend to kill that person, but you are responsible for killing that person. So the basic idea of Asham is that of being guilty of an offense. Girdlestone says that Asham is used where a sin, moral or ceremonial, has been committed through error, negligence, or ignorance. Although an offense is committed unknowingly or out of ignorance, it is not excusable. Just as the drunk driver did not intend to kill a pedestrian, but that drunk driver is still responsible for that person's death, even though it was an unintentional death. The use of this word, Asham, indicates that one is still guilty, and when one becomes conscious of the offense, one does not claim ignorance. Rather, one considers oneself guilty of the offense and acts appropriately. And in the Old Testament, the appropriate response when one became aware of this kind of guilt was to offer up a sin sacrifice. Perhaps this word shows the fact that sin is not only a conscious violation of God's law and standard. Even unconscious guilt is sin. I mean, even unconscious sin is guilt. In other words, even unconscious sin makes us blameworthy. Those are some Hebrew terms that are used to describe sin. Let's now look at some Greek terms that are used to describe sin. There are 6 major Greek terms for ungodliness. Again, we do not have the time to survey and explain them all. So for our purposes, we will summarize these 6 terms. So the first Greek word I want us to look at is the word parakoy. Parakoy means disobedience or failing to hear. And so it implies, so the basic meaning for parakoy is disobedience, but it implies failing to hear or hearing amiss or refusing to hear. Now, it's interesting that we find a similar idea in other languages too. For example, one of the Chinese words for obey is the word tinghua, which literally means listen to what is said. Okay, so this word parakoy shows that God has spoken his commands to us, and we disobey when we fail to hear what he has to say, or when we ignore what he has to say. The next Greek word I want us to look at is the word paraptoma. This word means trespass or offense. And so this word has the idea of making a false step, of transgressing, or of sinning. And the basic idea is that of falling where one should have stood upright. So it has this idea of failing to stand upright. And it points out that when we sin, we often get tripped up by sin, and we often get tripped up by the consequences. So we often fail, we often fall because of our sins. The next Greek word that is often used to describe sin is the word Angnoma. Angnoma refers to sins that are committed in ignorance. This word is used only in Hebrews 9:11, where it says, "But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sin the people had committed in ignorance." So this word is used only once in the entire Bible. The next Greek word I want us to turn our attention to is the word Hetama. Hetama means failure or defeat. This word is used twice, and it infers a diminishing or falling short of what should have been. And it carries the notion of being defeated. So, you know, when we sin, we often feel defeated. Oh gosh, I knew I should have done better. I think it carries a little bit of that idea. We have been defeated by sin. So that's what this word Hetama means. The next Greek word I want us to look at is anomia. Anomia. Anomia means lawlessness. Although it is rendered iniquity in the authorized version, it really means non-observance of the law. It never connotes the condition of living without law, but always one who acts contrary to the law. Thus, it's more than a sin of omission, it's also a sin of commission. The next Greek word I want to mention is Aesibia. Aesibia is often translated as godlessness, impiety, or ungodly. And the basic idea of this word is a lack of reverence for God and a neglect of the cultic or religious ceremonial obligations. It came to be more and more associated with philosophical and moral ideals, and thus it is a term reserved exclusively for the man with no religion and no morals. So when we encounter people who mock God, who make fun of religion, this is the word that we can use to describe that kind of behavior. Thus, Aesibia refers to one who lives an irreligious life, a life detached or distanced from God. This is reflected in a lack of religious practice and in distance from the moral life that is reflected in God. So those are some Greek and Hebrew words that are used to describe sin in the Bible. Now, let's try to define what sin is. Here is the Westminster Shorter Catechism's definition of sin. Sin is any lack of conformity to or transgression of the law of God. Okay, so this sounds like a good definition, but this definition is limited because it focuses only on the law and on our adherence to the law. Sin is more than that. For example, in Romans 14:23, it says, whatever is not of faith is sin. Theoretically, one could conform to the law legalistically, but still be regarded as committing sin. So we can keep the law, but we may still be sinning. So let's try to come up with a better definition of sin. Here is a working definition of sin. Sin is both the act and the result of falling short of God's character, God's will for us, and God's law. As an act, sin includes the lack of faith, it includes rebellion, and it includes active disobedience and violation of God's explicit standard. As a result, this definition that we're looking at here includes falling short of God's laws and standards, evil deeds, that is the opposite of good, trouble, and guilt. Thus, sin includes the inner person, attitude, and motivation, as well as the external deed or result. Let me give you two other definitions that you might find helpful. One of these is the definition, we sin whenever we disobey God. This definition encompasses everything that is included in the working definition of sin that we just looked at, but this simpler definition of sin sets sin within the context of breaking God's commandment, as well as within the context of committing actions that fractures or breaks our relationship with God. So we can say we sin whenever we disobey God. Okay, so that carries the idea of not only of disobeying his commandments, but it also means that whenever we disobey God, our relationship with God is broken or fractured. Here's a second definition of sin that you might find helpful. And that is, sin is doing what you know is wrong. Now, this definition comes from Charles Colson in one of his books. And I find that this definition is useful when talking with non-believers, because at one time or another, everyone has done what they know is wrong. This definition avoids getting into arguments about which moral standard we should follow. This does not mean that we ignore the Bible standard for right and wrong, but during the initial phases of reaching out to unbelievers, it may be helpful to avoid getting into that argument and then later fleshing out just what God's standard for righteous behaviors really are. So this ends part one of this video lecture on the nature and extent of sin. So please go to the next video and let's continue this video lecture.